Name, please?
Parker, Peter.
Ah, here we are. Table for two. Becker.
Parker.
That is what I said. Becker.
I guess no one understands the full potential of Peter Peckar. Anyways, welcome back, true believers and all you spectacular Spidey fans, to another infectious installment of Radioactive Review. Now, back in my Spider-Man the movie game review, I know I said that the next review was going to be about Ultimate Spider-Man, but I actually decided to do a little quick joke on you guys and actually do this one first for Spider-Man 3 on the PS2. Since the last game we talked about was in fact a movie tie-in game set within the Sam Raimi universe, I thought it'd be better if we actually continue that trend with talking about this game. Now, if you haven't seen it already, I did do a review on Spider-Man 3 on the PS3, and since we are breaking down the PS2 version of Spider-Man 3, I'm basically going to be restating some thoughts I had in that video back in this one. So if you want to fully be in the loop with what I said last time about Spider-Man 3, watch that review first and then come back to this one. But of course, every review is the same, where we are going to fully break down the story, gameplay, graphics, as well as point out some pros and cons about the game, as well as the best and worst moments, and then end it with my final score. And of course, huge thanks to Ricky Franklin for actually being the one to make all the incredible Radioactive Replay thumbnail logos that you see in all my videos, because without him, I would not be able to do this awesome series. So thank you, Ricky, once again, you are awesome. So back when I did my review for Spider-Man 3 on the PS3, I was actually discussing the possibility of that game being at least better, if not on par with Spider-Man 2 on the PS2. And of course, in my final decision for that game, I said that it was not better, but it was still a pretty good game to replay and enjoy. However, back in the year of 2007, the PS3 and the Xbox 360 were really new consoles at the time, and a lot of people couldn't actually afford them with their own budget. So this actually led Activision to create two separate tie-in titles for Spider-Man 3, one on the last-gen consoles, and that being the next-gen consoles of the time. And even by today's standards, the majority of people, when they hear the phrase Spider-Man 3, they usually think of, this. Oh, here we go! I'll save you, ma'am, don't... Oh. And the explosion didn't even go off. That's incredible. And even though I personally do not dislike Spider-Man 3 as much as other people do, the PS2 version, or the Wii version of Spider-Man 3, is the one that gets the most flack. However, there are some people out there that have defended this version of the game and actually claim it to be better than the PS3 version. So in regards to the story for Spider-Man 3 on the PS3, it was more focused on telling the narrative about the crime war and gangs that were going throughout New York City. That's why you had those big boss fights with Kingpin and 3 separate gang leaders during the game. Whereas surprisingly enough, I do actually prefer the PS2 version story over the PS3 version story, because they actually focus more about the symbiote's narrative. Specifically relating to the Morbius storyline of the game, the symbiote is actually brought up a lot more when you encounter Shriek and Morbius in the game's story. Plus, when you're fighting random enemies in the city, you will hear Toby mention some dialogue about the symbiote's powers, and that's just really nice detail that Activision and Vicarious Visions put within this game. And even though the storyline to this game is very similar to the PS3 version, it still does add a couple new pieces of narrative here and there during the game, so I do really like that. Now, moving on from the average storyline that this movie tie-in game has is, of course, the graphics. Now, as I said earlier, back in the year of 2007, it was considered to be the next generation era for the PS3 and the Xbox 360 consoles. And that's why Activision fully focused their resources on Treyarch's version of Spider-Man 3 to make sure that those platforms had the best graphics possible for Spider-Man at the time. But for those people who couldn't afford an Xbox 360 or a PS3, they went instead to the old school platforms of the PS2, the first Xbox, and the newer version of the Wii. And as you can see, Spider-Man 3 on the PS2 is a highly downgraded version of Spider-Man 3 on the PS3 and even Spider-Man 2 on the PS2. The textures in New York City are all over the place, the color palette isn't even apparent in the game, and the character designs overall aren't that pleasing to look at. Still, once again, that's because Activision had some budget restraints and they mainly focused their main priorities on Spider-Man 3 on the PS3. So even though the game's graphics aren't that appealing, it's understandable as to why they look this way. So I'll let the graphics slide for now. Now, moving on to one of the better aspects of the game is, of course, the soundtrack. So even though the graphics and the gameplay are highly different for both versions of Spider-Man 3, the one thing that remained consistent is the game's soundtrack. And of course, my thoughts remain the exact same on how I reviewed Spider-Man 3 on the PS3, is that this game's soundtrack is epic. Plus, whenever you're freely swinging around the city, the soundtrack will eventually kick up at some points, and it does make the game feel very, very cinematic. So even though the primary aspects of the game itself, like the gameplay and graphics, aren't that good, the soundtrack is top-notch. Especially my favorite being the final boss fight theme where you fight Venom in the construction site, which is epic. So moving on from the main aspects of the the game overall, we are going to now switch into the cons and the pros that the game has. And even though the primary gameplay and graphics of this game overall aren't anything special, there are actually not as many cons as you would think for this game. So the first con that I have is that this game uses reused cutscenes from Spider-Man 3 on the PS3. So once again, since Activision mainly used all their resources on the PS3 version of Spider-Man 3, they actually just reused cutscenes from that game and put it into the PS2 version. And granted, even though this game does have exclusive cutscenes only on the PS2 and the Wii version, it does in fact reuse other cutscenes from the other version of the game. So that's just one flaw of the game that can't be overlooked. So the next con that I have is that some of the voice performances in that game aren't all that great. Now, some of the voice performances in this game are a little bit mundane, ranging from the characters that you fight in the streets and also the main cast like Spider-Man and Venom. But there are some good ones in there like Dr. Connors and Morbius, but overall the voice cast felt a little bit flat in my opinion when playing the game. And again, that's mainly because they had the version already on the PS3 where they did their main performances on there, but on this one they felt a little bit bland. But still, that's just my opinion. And surprisingly enough, the last con that I have is actually relating to the load times of the game. So this mainly ranges from when you're doing side missions in the city to actually just progressing in the story, but the game overall does have very, very long load times. Plus, whenever you complete a side mission in the game will take a very long time to load just to get back for you swinging around New York City. And I am aware that this is because it's a very old game on the PS2 platform, but still, even Ultimate Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2 didn't have long load times. But for whatever reason, every time that you switch into a new section of the game, it takes a very long time for it to load. And I'm not sure why that is, but it definitely takes the immersion out when playing the game. And even to my own surprise, that's the last of the cons, everybody, so now we are going to move on to the pros of the game. So the first pro that I have is that this game, surprisingly enough, has almost the entirety of the cast voicing their characters in this game. Toby voices Peter, James Franco voices Harry, J.K. Simmons voices J. Jonah Jameson, Topher Grace voices Eddie Brock, Thomas Hayden Church voices Sandman, and so on. And even though some performances of them, like in Topher Grace and Sandman's performances, are a little bit mundane, it is very nice in a movie time game to get the entirety of the movie's cast to voice their respective characters in the game's story. And again, that just makes it more meaningful for the players playing the game. So the second pro is a small one, but that is that the game does in fact have a difficulty setting. If you're looking for an easy, fun ride and swinging around the city just for fun, you can definitely play the game on a simple difficulty, but if you actually want a challenge, you can play the game on a harder difficulty, which actually makes it a bit more challenging, especially when it relates to the boss fights, because some of these boss fights on the harder difficulty is actually pretty challenging, specifically the last one, but we'll get into that later. So the next pro that I have is that there are a lot of combos within this game. Not only do you have a very detailed and thought out skill tree, but you also have extremely well thought out combos to go along with it. Every time that you level up Spider-Man, you have the ability to gain skill points, which then you can buy for Spider-Man's different moves, either relating to traversal, combat, or webs. You can either use this to have Spider-Man gain a bigger chain combo, use some super moves, use some environmental attacks, and so on. And when you're upgrading Spider-Man, you do feel like that you are getting stronger every time that you purchase a new upgrade, which is very, very pleasing. And funny enough, when you have the black suit equipped, you actually have the fully upgraded potential for Spider-Man. All of Spider-Man's combos are fully accessible when you're in the black suit, plus you're much stronger and faster when executing all these attacks. And that just shows that Vicarious Visions actually tried out to make a fully in-depth combat system, which I do appreciate. So the next pro that I have with the game is that the map itself in the game is actually pretty big. Not only can you explore the other island in New York City, but the map itself when swinging around does feel very huge, especially back for the PS2, even after the big success of Spider-Man 2. Granted, New York City isn't as detailed as it should be, but it still is a pretty big map that you can explore. Plus, there's all sorts of content throughout the city that will keep you occupied, like crime waves, races, and bomb tours. So even though the game isn't the most visually compelling Spider-Man game out there, you will still have a pretty fun time just simply swinging around New York City. And speaking of swinging around New York City, the next pro that I have is the traversal in the game. Now, even though this game doesn't come close to replicating Spider-Man 2's swinging, you still will have a pretty fun time just simply traversing around New York City. You have tons of things ranging from web zipping, wall running, wall crawling, web swinging, jumping, charge jumping, and all sorts of cool maneuvers that you can do whenever you feel like in the game. Plus, when you upgrade Spider-Man, you have access to special tricks which you can use to gain more momentum and stamina. And even though the game doesn't have fall damage, it does give you more of an incentive to try and pull off stylish moves when trying to traverse around the city. So even though the swinging isn't better than Spider-Man 2, you will still have a pretty fun time with it. So the second to last pro that I have with the game is actually the boss fights are very, very interesting. So during the game, when you encounter a boss fight, you actually have to keep on your toes, because sometimes they might be a bit challenging. You can either fight a boss that will send enemies to attack you, or you can fight a boss that will throw things at you, or fight two bosses at the same exact time, which is very, very hard. And along with that, each boss has an actual certain weakness that comes along with them, so you actually have to try and figure out what it is, and then try and attack them at their weakest point, which is very, very interesting to do. So while all the boss fights in the PS3 version were simply button mashing, here you actually have to try and think about what to do, which I do appreciate the thought of detail that Vicarious Visions put in these boss fights. And the last pro that I have is that you can switch from black suit to red suit on the fly. So of course, as you guys know me, Web of Shadows Shadows is my favorite Spider-Man game of all time, and the main reason is because you have the ability to freely swap between the red suit and the black suit. But funny enough, the feature that I love so much from Web of Shadows was actually first implemented within this game. So without this game coming out, Web of Shadows may have not had that feature in it, which is really surprising. However, the one thing that this game managed to do is try and actually feel like that you are struggling with the black suit in this game. As the game progresses, you'll want to try and use the black suit more because of how stronger and faster you are in it. But when you're fighting enemies in the game, you can only wear it for a limited amount of time before it fully consumes you. And the game makes you feel like that you are personally fighting the symbiote, because when you try and take it off, you have to personally press buttons in order to actually take it off of you. And that just shows the interaction that they give the player when trying to take off the symbiote in the game to actually make you feel like that you are personally struggling with it. And overall, the symbiote feature that they put in this game is awesome. So now with all the cons and the pros out of the way, we are going to move on to the best and worst moments and then end it with my final score. So for me, the best moment of the game is easily Morbius. Everything about his story arc in the game was just awesome, and since this is the very first Spider-Man game we ever fight Morbius in, I think they did do him justice. His voice acting is really good, his boss fights were fun, and the challenge that he offers you when fighting him and Shriek at the same time is very, very interesting. Plus, when you complete his story arc in the game, you actually get more of an insight in regards to the symbiote, which is awesome. And as for the worst moment of this game, I would easily say the last boss fight with Venom. Overall, not only is that boss fight much more challenging than any other boss fight in this Spider-Man game, but also when you play it on hard, it's really, really challenging to do over and over again. Plus, at one section of the boss fight, you actually have to wait for Harry as New Goblin to help you fight Venom, but sometimes he'll never help you, which is very frustrating. So not only is this a hard boss fight overall, but the game itself will sometimes glitch and make it even more challenging for you than it already was. So even though I do like all the boss fights in this game, the only one that gets on my nerves the most is the last one. So everybody, with that being said, I do think that this game does have some fun stuff in it, even though it's obviously not the best game to look at visually and the gameplay is a bit rinse and repeat. It still is a passable movie tie-in game given the budget that Activision and Vicarious Visions had with this project. I do think that they did a pretty good job with it, and with that, I'm going to give this game a solid 7 out of 10. The boss fights are a pretty good challenge, you'll have lots of fun just freely swinging around the city, and also the black suit is just tons of fun to play around with. But anyways guys, that brings an end to my Radioactive review for Spider-Man 3 on the PS2. Let me know all your thoughts about this game in the comments section down below. What do you think about it? Do you like it, love it, or hate it? And I know I already said I was going to do my Ultimate Spider-Man Radioactive review next, but that is actually going to come out next after this one is released. I just wanted to put this one out to mess around with you guys, but still I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless. But anyways guys, thank you all so much for watching, and once again, stay tuned soon for Ultimate Spider-Man's review. Stay spectacular, Spidey fans. Peace out.
This game is not recommended for people with vertigo, arachnophobia, a fear of heights, or a weak heart. May cause outbursts of joy, exhilaration, and the feeling of being Spider-Man.